In this episode, I'm joined by Rico Sneller, who is a professor at Leiden University. He is the author of Wild Beasts of the Philosophical Desert, Philosophers on Telepathy and Other Exceptional Experiences. In this episode, we discuss his soon-to-be-published book, Perspectives on Synchronicity, Inspiration and the Soul, alongside discussions on death, suffering, modernity, mysticism, the work of Jacques Derrida, and limit experiences. I would like to thank all my patrons for making all this work possible, and if you'd like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the Hermitix community, please find our Patreon, donation, merchandise and Discord links in the description below. Enjoy. So Rico Sneller, thanks for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you.
So before we jump in, we are going to be talking about your new book, which hasn't been released. You sent me a chapter called Perspectives on Synchronicity, Inspiration and the Soul. But before we jump into this, we're primarily going to be talking about death and suffering. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what it is you do.
Thanks a lot. So, Rico Sneller, I've been teaching for a long time at the universities of Utrecht, Leiden and Eindhoven in the Netherlands. I wrote my PhD thesis on the French philosopher Jacques Derrida and his relation to negative theology, which is a tradition in the history of Christianity and also Islam, by the way, and Judaism, which claims that nothing can be said about God, but we can only be silent about him and speak about him in negation. But while working on this thesis, I got more and more interested in Derrida's relation to Judaism and the Jewish tradition, especially the tradition of Jewish philosophy. So that's how my, let's say, intellectual quest started. I started becoming interested in the Jewish tradition, especially its philosophical dimensions, and Rosenzweig, Levinas, of course, Hermann Cohen, Maimonides, etc. So gradually, I also obtained. I got interested into Asian traditions of thinking and philosophy. I was practicing yoga, etc., and I read a lot about it. And in consciousness. So that is still my predominant field of interest. Consciousness, the mysteries of consciousness, and I connect that to philosophy. Insofar as the 19th century, 20th century reaction to the age of enlightenment, the critical reaction of enlightenment, focused on the secrets, the depth of consciousness as something which stretches out far beyond the mere rational. And that's what did not stop fascinating me ever since. It starts with Schopenhauer and it goes on until Freud and Jung and beyond. And I must say that there was some colleagues who raised my interest for this, especially Hans Gerding, who became my colleague at some moment in Leiden University, extraordinary professor for the metaphysics of theosophy, something like that. He was a philosopher and a parapsychologist. And he inspired my interest for a lot of things that I was completely unaware of, but most particularly, let's say, the soft underbelly of philosophy. In other words, the experiential dimension of philosophy. And I discovered that there's a whole part of the philosophical tradition that is either repressed or completely ignored, which started interesting me. For example, Schopenhauer. Well, everybody who knows philosophy knows Schopenhauer, but who knows that Schopenhauer was one of the first to take what we call today psychic or paranormal phenomena seriously. It is unbelievable that a lot of philosophers are completely unaware of it, and if they were, they simply deny it and don't take it seriously. Whereas for Schopenhauer, it was a confirmation. He even called it a confirmation of his metaphysics of will. So, and I take it seriously at the philosophical level. So I am not into those casuistry, like something happened over there, out there, and so that can be multiplied until infinity. But I'm interested in the philosophical perception and reflection upon the unusual experiences. So it just interrupt me if I'm talking too long, but that's and then I was already interested in psychoanalysis, Freud and Jung, etc. And then at some point I read in the bibliography to Freud's interpretation of dreams, a very interesting title, The Philosophy of Mysticism, in German, of course, Philosophie der Mystik by Karl Duprel. I hadn't heard about this person before, but the title fascinated me, and so I started. I tried to find this book. I read it, and it was one of the most beautiful books I ever read, together with a few others, but not too many others. That's how it really started. So Karl Duprel, a 19th century, Schopenhauerian thinker, focusing on the unconscious. Well, he called it transcendental consciousness with a Kantian term. And he started speculating about accessing it, or explaining why it is impossible to access it in a normal way, but in an intelligent, philosophical way. So he was not just such a speculating lunatic, like there are so many of them, but he's an intellectual, a very sensitive person. Okay, I can talk at length about this Karl Duprel. Another hero I discovered, I think he discovered him before, was Ludwig Klages. He lived 1872, 1956. He wrote this book, Der Geist als Widersacher der Seele, The Spirit as the Adversary of the Soul, a very thick book, 1,400 pages. I had it on my bookshelf for 20 years or so, and it always... It was how you say, lurking or looming at me. It was looking, I had a very boring cover, just simply red or rust brown or so. So there was nothing attractive about it. But I felt attracted by this book. I started putting it on the agenda for my classes. So I forced myself to teach about it. And when preparing to read it, I was first desperate because, this is so difficult. How can I ever teach about this if I don't understand it myself? But okay, I still persisted, and I managed to teach about it, and I continued to do so for a long time. And I can tell you, it's not a secret that my students, they did not understand Klages' text himself because it's very difficult, but he liked him. They liked him. They liked him. If you let me, I can explain why that is. But it has to do with Klages' emphasis on, let's say, pre-reflective, pre-rational dimensions of consciousness, which come to the fore in our non-conscious activities, sleeping, dreaming, acting out of enthusiasm, of inspiration, etc. So I could talk about Klages at length, but I will keep it to the basics.
Well, I do wonder if he's now going to return, because I do need to ask you the Hermitix question. So you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
I think Ludwig Klages, Karl Duprel, and Jacques Derrida. And especially the latter, one would be surprised to have him in such a conversation. But you could also say, why put those other weirdos in a conversation with Derrida? But all of the 3 were disreputed. You say they were subject of discussion, of debate by academic thinkers who were worried about this kind of thinking, but for different reasons. Derrida was also very much. I'm looking for the word disreputed. He was subject of debate. He was awarded with a kind of award in, I think, by the University of Cambridge or Oxford, and a lot of English philosophers, they withdrew and they found him a charlatan or something like that. Crazy. I don't care about that. But, so these 3, I'd love to, but I'm afraid that it would be, I'm not sure that this discussion will be successful, as I would fear that discussion among any great philosopher might not be successful, because great philosophers have a tendency to not really understand the other, even though they would like to, or perhaps they would understand those other philosophers better than these understand themselves. So it might lead to more confusion.
Do you think there's a connection between those three? I don't know Duprel all that well, and I've only read some Derrida, but do you think that there's some form of philosophical connection between those three thinkers?
There is, but one has to search for it. It is so those who are familiar with Derrida are familiar with one of his key terms, logocentrism. So putting a logos, putting ratio, reason at the center, and a conception of reason which pretends to have access to truth, and a truth which somehow corresponds with the structure of reason itself, which is a circular way of thinking anyway. But that is what is addressed by Derrida. And but the term logocentrism originates in Klages. Not many people know this, but Klages introduced the term. And there's one article about it which I somehow found. But those who are interested in Derrida will never read thinkers like Ludwig Klages, because that's really a different cup of tea, as you English would say. It's a different kind of thinking. And the other way around, admirers of Klages, or let's say the philosophy of life, are not likely to read thinkers like Derrida. But although there are connections, I can tell you the most surprising one. I focused on this subject for our book, Wild Beasts of the Philosophical Desert, Philosophers on Telepathy and Other Exceptional Experiences, that Derrida wrote an article on telepathy. That's not one of his most famous texts, to say the least. And even if you read it at first impression, you might say, oh, this is a text on Freud. But I studied the text several times, a difficult text. It is also autobiographical text. But you find sentences in it in which Derrida says that he cannot simply believe that non-telepathy exists. So he cannot believe that non-telepathy exists, which is the other way around. So he suggests that telepathy is the usual, ordinary circumstance, the ordinary condition. And that's so interesting. It is really a kind of utterance or a claim by a philosopher who is really a philosopher, who somehow lives within his own world, which he pretends to be not just his own world, but, a world which extends beyond the boundaries of his own spirit. So this links Derrida to another subject which one would be amazed to find in his thinking. That's the concept or the subject or the topic of synchronicity. Mm-hmm. Synchronicity, like the concurrence or the simultaneity of events which have no causal connection amongst themselves. I remember Hans Redding, my philosopher parapsychology friend, when first conversations I had with him, and I told about my PhD about Derrida, and he did not know Derrida so well, and he asked me, "Are you aware that? Do you know if in Derrida if Derrida pays attention to synchronicity?" And I was amazed. Said, "In fact, yes, absolutely. He doesn't use the term." But you only have to know Derrida just a little bit to be able to say that what is called synchronicity, it's a Jungian term, though it's not limited to Jung. But so that synchronicity is all over, it can be found all over Derrida's work. For example, he writes about a topic, and then he starts saying, well, when I started writing about the topic, I was called by a friend who started to talk about the same subject, and then something happened, and that also coincided with my topic, etc., etc. There are remarkable examples of this. So synchronicity is everywhere, all throughout Derrida's work, even though he doesn't use the term. So you see there are links between Derrida and, let's say, Klages or Duprel or these kind of thinkers.
Well, wouldn't the clearest link between Klages and Derrida would be that they're both, to a certain degree, whether or not they're in agreement, working with Heidegger? So there's the letters between Heidegger and Klages, and Derrida was, most notably influenced by the work of Heidegger.
Yeah, I don't know if Klages was influenced by Heidegger. I did not find any reference to Heidegger in his work. Well, I'm not claiming that there is none, really? But I didn't find any reference. No. Well, there may be, but I didn't. I think I read a lot by Ludwig Klages, but I never found a reference to Heidegger. So I think that there is a kind of, well, of course he heard about him, and I don't know if Heidegger ever refers to Klages, maybe once or twice. Again, I don't know, but there could be a reference. But these two thinkers, they're completely, they have lots of ideas in common, but they are not amicable toward each other. Klages was a very independent mind. He was outside of the academy. He just gained a living by lecturing, by writing, by doing graphological research. I think that Heidegger would have qualified him as a biologistical thinker, something like that, as a metaphysical thinker, which in a way is true, insofar as Klages also claims the term metaphysics for his own way of thinking. But I think that Klages is such a giant, and giants don't like other giants. So Heidegger was a giant as well, of course. But in terms of today's philosophy, I think Heidegger is overemphasized. Of course, he's a great philosopher. Of course, he is. But there are too many thinkers into Heidegger, and I think it's time to just leave him at rest for a while, and to take other thinkers who are just as great as he is. So that's why I prefer. And I think I'm more than that. I'm convinced that there is more in Klages than in Heidegger. What I find in Klages that cannot be found in Heidegger, I think, of course this can be debated, is the notion of experience. I think Heidegger is just struggling with his own, the emptiness which his loss of his Catholicism left in him. Well, of course, this can be debated. Many Heideggerians will disagree with me. Okay, that can be debated. But this is what I believe. So he has abandoned the religion or faith of his youth, and he pretended to find something as an alternative in, here and there, ultimately in Eckhart again, and German poetry. But I think he never really succeeded in finding an alternative. And that's what kept him rolling, so to say, Heidegger. Whereas Klages, well, you can say the same about Klages, but I think Klages has a more intimate connection to experience. That's what makes Klages more convincing to me. Mm-hmm. Although, of course, I'm not Klagesian all throughout. Of course, there are still always other thinkers. But Klages has something convincing since he has experience, to put it shortly.
Okay, well, I think these three will probably return at some point, most likely. So this book, Perspectives on Synchronicity, Inspiration and the Soul, why did you write it? And is there a sort of a purpose behind writing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So pragmatically, it was a kind of harvest of many things I have been teaching in my classes in the years before, and which I didn't want simply to let slip away through my fingers. I wanted to preserve it somehow, my course notes. But more importantly, I am strongly convinced that there is a kind of common sense in academic philosophy. Well, many forms of common sense, but broader and smaller ones. But I don't like common sense at all. I'm getting excited over that. So I don't like trends, and there are trends in what is called transcontinental philosophy as well. I don't like that. I think that there's always more to say. I am interested in those philosophers that have been repressed or ignored or marginalized. And I discovered that studying those marginalized philosophers is worthwhile. But I still leave out the most important thing. So I gave two reasons. First, I want to harvest my own teachings from the years before. Secondly, I dislike consensus and common sense formation and canonization of philosophy. But most importantly, I think that there's the role of what is called science today. The word science has been usurped by the natural sciences. And even worse, by those, mediocre minds working in the natural sciences. They claim science to themselves, which I think is a crime against humanity. And that has affected or infected the humanities and philosophy. To the extent that large strands in contemporary thinking believe that they should somehow, that the sole task for philosophy is to interpret the findings of the natural sciences, whether they apply to nature or to the human mind or soul. Make it concretely, what is called neurology, science of theory of mind, those kind of approaches. Whereas I think that what has happened through this is a complete neglect or discontinuation of a very fertile and interesting way of thinking on consciousness, which has started to develop. Always already, but especially in the 19th century, as of the age of Romanticism, which has simply been discontinued and, repressed and discontinued and neglected, whatever you wish. So that I'm asking myself so many times when I read the thinkers, I mentioned Paul Duprel, but there are others in Fechner, for example, or Lazarus Hellenbach, or Schubert, or you name it, or Klages, for example. Why are we not resorting to these thinkers anymore? Why are we limiting ourselves to the sole materialistic frameworks which are imposed upon philosophy today? And why are we blind to this imposition, and why are we blind to the narrowness and the contingency of the premises which belong to this materialistic paradigm? That is what strikes me. It makes me so emotional because I feel it's unfair and it's stupid even. This prevailing materialism, which is blind to its own premises. What is done, in fact, is just one takes as absolute a particular strand or approach to philosophy, which originates in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm referring to empiricism, and never questions its starting premises of that form of empiricism. And that what is the inevitable result is that scientists, or people who call themselves scientists, are confronted with phenomena that do not seem to fit in the frameworks that have started by setting up for themselves. I'm referring to quantum mechanics and theory of relativity, but this is almost a cliche. And that's. But I although I'm not a physical scientist at all, I don't understand theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. But as far as I can tell, I can understand it. I would say, I could have predicted you, dear Mr. or Mrs. Quantum physicist. I could have told you, and not just me. So many other thinkers whom you have preferred to ignore or neglect could have told you. And now with thinkers like Einstein and others, they are the greatest minds you can imagine, absolutely. But they're struggling with the limits of the frameworks within which they were raised. So I'm not claiming that I have a solution, because I cannot make undone by myself what has been corroborated by centuries of physical scientific thinking. But it's blind, and I think that social and narrow-minded mechanisms are also contributing to this, to the the fixing of paradigms.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is where do you know that the default materialist worldview, which is held, practically by basically everyone in the West, unless they have a clear alternative and state otherwise. Where do you think socially that's sort of come from? This the all prevailing materialism.
Yeah, I think there are several explanations, and I can only highlight or mention a few of them, of course, and there will always be yet another explanation to be given. The first and the easiest explanation is that it worked, or rather, I should say, it seemed to work. It seemed to give results, following a certain way of crucifying nature, put it on the Procrustes bed of our research, and then it will give some results which seem to work. But that is the easiest and superficial explanation. I think a great role is played by social pressure and by anxiety. Anxiety is most important, perhaps. So it seems so convenient to be able to explain nature, or to believe that one can one day explain nature, to be finally aloof of the intervention of inexplicable events or forces or whatever you call it. It feels safe. Well, also very disillusioning, of course, because, well, we don't have anything to hope for anymore. But it might feel safe. So I think that plays a big role. And then again, like scientists are people like everybody, so they're very sensitive to social pressure, not just by the man of the street or but by their peers. So that also gives rise to group pressure, and it feels like a religious community. Not a good one, but a bad one, in which social pressure reigns. And now they're calling, oh, this is not scientific if you do that, and please keep to the rules of science, etc. In Corona times, we only have one reliable resort, and that is science. It is as though I were in the Middle Ages, in which people would say, oh no, it's only the church who could give us relief and explanation, etc. It's just the same. It's just the same. So there's no difference. Just the names have been changed. So, and as I am an individual being myself, I'm not claiming that I'm insensitive to group pressure, but I am always alerted when I feel group pressure, and I hate it. I can tell you, this is a personal remark. I hate it. I don't like pressure by nobody. And if I feel it, wherever it comes from, I feel a tendency to just flee. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So of course this has risks of its own, because nobody can find truth all by himself. Of course, everybody is in need of others, but not by being pressured by others. I believe, but this may not be the question that you wanted to ask me. That may be in other direction, but just let me make one. I believe in dialogical relationship with others, which is not identical with being pressured by others. Dialogue is something which I believe in, and dialogues can take many different forms, always unexpected and unpredictable. But I think the main characteristic of dialogue is that it unsettles one, unsettles the fixed ground, the paradigm within which I have hitherto believed that I could live and be safe. So I think that materialism. I think that materialism is already overcome by the most clever of the natural scientists, like the Einsteins and the Niels Bohrs, etc., because they are not materialists anymore. They are not materialists at all. It's just the mediocre scientists who are. So if you just dig deep into the atom, you find out that there is no atom. There are no atoms.
Do you think then that culturally this is the reason that especially within philosophical circles and obviously scientific circles, that concepts such as spirituality and mysticism are taken as sort of things that we don't dabble in? They're not serious. Do you think that for me, there's quite clearly a connection there, but do you think that this is the main reason why there's been a serious cultural damage to the supposed seriousness of mysticism and spirituality?
Absolutely. I can tell you this from experience. For many, many years, 15 or 20 years or so, I had at Leiden University a series of small conferences on, we called them philosophy and spirituality. They were very popular. A lot of people came. And not just nobodies, but psychiatrists, students, or professionals, or all kind of. But at the level university, it was ignored. It was ignored by colleagues. So can you imagine? It was crazy. But I think what you call spirituality, mysticism suffers from is that it has been usurped or appropriated by free-floating minds, or by people who think that they can buy an easy ticket to the absolute, which is impossible. It starts already with the question: what is spirituality, or what is mysticism? That already is a discussion without end. But if we do as if we knew what it means, if we just start studying mystical traditions, we find out that there is a lot in it, which is interesting and worth studying. And I found out, but this is very revolutionary what I'm saying now, that even let's say the mainstream philosophical canon has its mystical dimensions. I want to claim that the greatest thinkers of the Western canon are ultimately mystical thinkers. Because it starts with what I would call a mystical insight. In other words, an insight which cannot be verified, perhaps not even repeated by anybody else. What the rest of the thinkers and academics do is try to appropriate a thinker's thoughts by studying their work. And try to organize it, reorganize it, compare it. But what they cannot get access to is its root, its origin. That keeps fascinating us. Even Hegel, Hegel has many problematic dimensions, but at root, at bottom, he has mystical ideas. And this is not so difficult to explain. You can go from Hegel to Schelling to Böhme to Spinoza, perhaps even to, certainly one could go to Kabbalah, Kabbalah by Isaac Luria. That's an interesting substrand in Western tradition of philosophy, a Jewish mystical tradition. Mm-hmm. Mystical or spirituality, it is worth studying, not just as a tradition by itself, but also insofar and in as much as it affects the root of mainstream canonized Western philosophy itself. I dare to claim that I can elucidate this for a lot of Western thinkers whom I have studied, and not the least that there is a mystical dimension to them. But of course, I would have to explain what I understand by mystical. But many people just leave it floating in the air what they understand by mystical, and that damages the discussion.
Could you give one famous example and explain what you mean by mystical?
Yeah, so since I started talking about Hegel, I think that if you look at the beginning of Hegel's philosophy, there was a felt need, both in Hegel and his mates, his friends Schelling and Hölderlin, to restore a lost unity, which they felt was lost in Kantian thinking, and Fichte as well. There was an urge to re-establish a felt unity, although Hegel believed that felt unity is not completely felt or not felt enough. It can only be anticipated. This might start becoming complex, maybe too complex for the podcast.
No,
but Hegel, in proportion to the development of Hegel's thinking, Hegel discovered that time must be introduced in his mystical surmise, or his mystical feeling of everything being connected, and temporality, so development, or in other words, history. So the more you insist on history or historicity, the less you will find a mystical notion in Hegel. Like Heidegger, for example, who he insisted on historicity, and he lost the mystical intuition in Hegel. Well, he found it on his own way, Heidegger. But the more you insist that historicity belongs to the mystical, or to the immediate awareness, which is a contradiction in terms, an interesting contradiction in terms, the more you can corroborate or underpin the claim that, something mystical, something, an awareness of something absolute is present in Hegel's philosophy. So it is difficult to explain because I'm already bringing up the contradictions, which one might overemphasize and thereby lose the mystical element in Hegelian thinking. It could, to say it in a simpler way, one could also refer to the Spinozistic roots of Hegelian thinking, which might be a shortest way to showing, or at least making convincing, mystical elements in Hegelian thinking. But one could also, that's a third strategy, refer to the conclusion of the phenomenology of the spirit. That's absolute knowledge, absolute knowing, which could be interpreted as a mystical chapter in Hegel, albeit that it differs from Schelling's approach, let alone of a medieval trajectory.
So what then is your, sort of, if you can, your definition of mysticism?
This is an impossible, tormenting question. I can exculpate myself by saying that my definition will be wrong. It will be a wrong definition anyway, you can be sure about that. My definition must also pay a tribute to the times in which we are living, because I cannot simply repeat a medieval approach or not even a Hegelian. We're living in 21st century. Let's put it this way. The mystical is in thinking is the folly or craziness, and this is not so original. I'm thinking of my hero Jacques Derrida, who once said, to summarize his own thinking, "Une certaine folie doit veiller sur la pensée." A certain craziness or folly must keep an eye to thinking. I'm sure you like it. I see you smiling right now. The podcast listeners may not see it, but I like this a lot. A certain is the craziness, I don't know if that's a word, or folly, or insanity, or insanity. And insanity must keep an eye, must be awake over thinking, veiller sur, must keep an eye to think. So there must be something crazy about our thoughts. And what I'm not claiming is that we should not ultimately take ourselves seriously. Well, we should not take ourselves too seriously, but philosophy is not simply, it's identical to making jokes. So that, of course, you can be fun, you can be humoristic, of course. Thinking without humor is not a good way of thinking. But the humor should be serious in turn. So because what happens in our world is too serious to just make fun of. We are living in a world in which people are dying, but in which holocausts have taken place, in which mass slaughtering in Rwanda are taking place, and genocides are still going on. So that is not a joke. We cannot make fun of that. So I would, the mystical today I would define it in terms of kind of craziness. A certain craziness should always pervade our thinking. That's what I love. And I like crazy people. I like it, especially if they combine that craziness with a form of intelligence. Because, but even if not, there are different forms of intelligence. I like crazy artists. I like crazy people. You can find crazy people anywhere, and there's always something wise in it.
Okay. So moving on. So the chapter you sent me was primarily on death and to a certain extent suffering, and I think this is like when I spoke to David Beth, he said that this is the question of sort of our spiritual reality now. It's one of the biggest questions, and it's always tough to answer. But why do you believe that modernity, the contemporary social domain that we're living in at the moment, has cultivated the attitude that it has towards death and suffering? Death and suffering is seen as always the worst, if not the worst outcome. It has to be avoided. It has to be not spoken about. It can't be seen. For all intensive purposes, it is entirely ignored to the point where it's actually deemed not a thing. I would argue that we within modernity we're seen as immortals who we see ourselves as immortals who are just ignorant to our actual fate. So one of the interesting things that Dmitry Orlov said to me recently is that within our current state there has to be a reason for people to die. It's never just old age, and it's never just, they got too old and they died. There's always something that we could have cured, that we could have stopped, so we have this attitude that is entirely negative towards both death and suffering. I don't know, where do you believe that this has come from, and in what way do you think this affects our notion of spirituality and belief and our culture?
Already the way you phrase your question entails so many interesting formulations which I would like to draw on, because your question points at ways of, maybe not answering it, but dealing with it. Absolutely. So if suffering were taken seriously as mysteries or as crazy things or crazy experiences, that could not fail to affect the truths that we have collected for ourselves, that we have developed for ourselves by science or by ideologies or even religions or whatever truths we have. It's a kind of blurring or erasing of the truths that we have found. Or maybe not erasing, that would imply that whatever we found out by ourselves is worth nothing. That's what I don't believe either. I think that death or suffering are experiences that somehow interrupt what we are our truths, whatever they are, whether they are scientific truths or ideological or religious or whatever forms of truth that we have. It interrupts it, but not necessarily to delete them, but to add something to it, which might ultimately enhance them. Enhance them. I believe that what is called with maybe abstract term, alterity, otherness, has to do with suffering and or death. So they are experiences which cannot be located. We do not really have a proper place for them. We try to give the proper place by saying, death is just the end of things. It just happens. Everything is finite. So, what to say about it? But that is not really a place. That is just neglecting or ignoring death. That excluding the possibility that death is not something that can only be defined in a negative way, like death is the cessation of heart throb or blood circulation, as it is always done. But it comes down to excluding that death might also mean something positively, because that question is always evaded. So what might death mean or be positively? Not death as cessation of something. So I have tried to develop in my book the hypothesis, because it cannot be more than a hypothesis, that death positively is defined or interpreted is an enhancement or a perpetuation, albeit on a different level, of trends that we can already discern throughout our lifetimes, or what we call life. Because, when we take death seriously, we might perhaps not be so sure anymore of what life means. So then the question becomes, so what trends do we see throughout lifetimes that might be perpetuated or even enhanced at death? And there I'm inclined to thinking that what we have been used to calling the subliminal or the unconscious is at stake. And the unconscious, of which Freud said that is deemed to remain unconscious, but of which I believe that it somehow comes to the fore or pops up, albeit in a transformed way, that gives reason to speculate about its perpetuation. I'm thinking here especially about, tendencies that may show themselves over people's lifetime, like maturing. Maturing is a very interesting phenomenon. So maturing is not just transporting yourself through time until the end follows, but maturing is learning learning from experience, or not learning, because not everybody learns from experience, but it's not excluded that I may learn from experience, or that might not necessarily in the form of a rational account of it. That's sometimes impossible. How to account rationally for the Holocaust, for example, that's perhaps too over demanding, but to integrate it, or to give it a place, albeit as a continuing trauma, because the Holocaust, this is a very radical example, but you can imagine less radical examples, or to give that a place by not giving it a place. Ultimate traumas cannot really be given a place, but like dealing with it, having to convey it over your lifetime and acting out of it, by not being able to prevent that it acts from my actions. Albeit in the forms of tears in my eyes when I'm looking at things that happen in my life, and those tears betraying past traumas, for example. Everybody has traumas to a greater or lesser degree. So maturing. But also what I believe are talents. Everybody is talented in one way or another. Well, some is talented in forms of intelligence or creativity or in a social way. I love to define talent not as a capacity in a positive sense, but as a weakness. Talent is a weakness insofar as it is a kind of a puncture in the tire of my cycle, through which something comes in, which I don't know where it comes from. Like being talented in speaking languages, for example. I love language, and that's maybe a kind of talent in some way. I love language. But it's not just I love it. But where does it come from? I don't know. Some say, it's a kind of complex junction in your brain infrastructure, etc. Well, I may have other deficits as well for other things, so like with everybody. But that doesn't satisfy me. I believe that the talent, and once more, everybody has talents. Everybody has talents. There are different forms of talent. There are weak spots through which what I am inclined to calling the subconscious or the subliminal might come in. Mm-hmm. And that can be used throughout our lifetimes in social context. It can be put at the service of others. If we do not do that, it would be worth having those talents. I love my talents, which I'm endowed with, and I love to put them at the service of others, and I think that many others love that too. Because if you're living out your talent, I feel that, to make it personal, you are very talented. You may have many talents, but one of them, I feel that you are seriously interested in someone. That's what I feel. You have a lot of other talents, if I got to know you better, but this one is present, absolutely. And that is something precious. And if you put that at the service of others, I cannot deny that gives some pleasure. It gives some pleasure. It's compare this to sexual image, like something is streaming through you, which wants to get out, which wants to be distributed or disseminated. Well, it's a nice feeling. And if it's impeded, it feels like, it doesn't give you a nice feeling. So a talent is another way of... sorry, I forgot the question. A talent and maturing are ways in which the subliminal is already showing or manifesting itself throughout our lifetimes. And if it be so, I'm not sure, but if it be so that at death, a certain daily resistance against subliminal forces is lifted, then it might be so that those talents and forces or tendencies are simply enhanced or continued on a higher or different level. I'm not against saying that it is discontinuous, or at least on a higher level. And you can add that up with further speculations or with religious interpretations. I have no objection to that.
Well, yeah, one thing that I noticed when you're talking about that earlier on with regards to death is actually this sort of split. I mean, I've been reading the Hermetica recently, and it seems that if you go from like the Corpus Hermeticum on one side and then the Bible on the other, there's two routes there, and one is cyclicity. You know, you were on about maturing, and this sort of, birth, growth, maturation, and then an end, but it's always within a cycle. Whereas if you are attuned to or have a belief in the Bible side, it's a straight arrow to a certain end, and then there's no cycle. And it seems to me that what modernity has done with regards to death and suffering is it's taken the Bible route and given us a straight arrow, so we go from birth to death, and then we die, and that's the end, and it's a straight arrow. But it's also removed the entire spiritual teleology that used to be attached to that. So there's no actual. So the death of, in a certain sense, the death of God is the teleology of Christianity, but without the pleasant or bad end. So if you remove the end point of that teleology, then there's no purpose in the direction. Whereas, and that form of death, that belief in death, removes any sort of meaning, whereas cyclicity doesn't, because you understand your place within you're not privileged. You are within a cycle. You're simply within other cycles, like a gear in a complex clock. And do you think that this has something to do with this idea that we want to believe that we are we have the privileged journey, as opposed to just being another cyclicity ourselves?
Thank you for asking this question, and I surely agree with you that there are tendencies in the history of Christianity which completely support what you're saying, unfortunately, and that may have to do with this erroneous conception, or at least a one-sided conception of Aristotelian teleology. As you know, Christianity has been highly determined by Aristotle, at least in scholasticism, and that has not stopped with the tradition of the Reformation, because that's, of course, it discontinued Aristotelian thinking, but meanwhile, intellectual thinking in Europe has been highly impregnated with Aristotelian conceptuality. So what I believe is necessary is to rid the Christian tradition, and any tradition, Islam as well, and Judaism as well, and whatever, of a superficial form of teleology, and reinvent it. So as regards the Bible, and confronting it with the life esoteric tradition, I think that the Bible as such is not a unity. It's not a unity at all. The Bible is a very complex book in which many different traditions are united, onto which unity has been imposed for reasons of power, and you can imagine scholastic. But I know the Bible very, very well, and also the source text, and I can tell you that it's very difficult to impose unity on the Bible. I'm not saying that there is none, but it's difficult. There are different traditions coming together in the Bible. Recently, not recently, I've been studying Franz Rosenzweig many times. It's a Jewish thinker. He wrote in 1921, he published his Star of Redemption, which is a very interesting, intriguing book, which sets things straight in a different way as regards the concept of teleology that you're referring to. And he suggests, Rosenzweig was a Jewish, Hegelian thinker as well. Interesting. He wrote his thesis about Hegel, und der Staat, but he also criticized Hegelian thinker, and he renewed the conception of philosophy and also of Christianity and Judaism in his own way. I could recommend studying Rosenzweig. But what Rosenzweig tried to do is to combine teleology with eternity. And that is very difficult to do, because it seems contradictory. It would be too difficult for this podcast to try to pretend even to explain this within a few minutes. I try to be as short, as concise as I can. So Rosenzweig makes a distinction between ordinary temporality, like past, present, and future, but which is a kind of flat, one-dimensional conception of time. And we make the mistake of doing as if this were an absolute Trinity, as if the past were, whereas that form of temporality is surrounded by a deeper layer of temporality, in which past, present, and future are something eternal. But again, it's very difficult to think this, and it's not thinking that can simply be explained and just tested. Well, do you explain? No, this is something, it must correct the ways in which we are accustomed to thinking us ourselves. Since we are Europeans, let's not forget, we are Europeans. We are used to thinking in a particular way, which, for example, a lot of people in an African tradition or Asian tradition are not familiar. So we are also very contingent in that. So in Rosenzweig, for example, he speaks about the coming of the kingdom. And the coming of the kingdom, he says, so I'm trying to associate this with what you asked me, a very justified question. The coming of the kingdom, God's kingdom, he calls it. It's something which is both futurist and present and even past, which seems contradiction by excellence. How can that be? How can the future be past? But it has to do with an eternal coming. The kingdom is always to come. And if you reread Derrida, he speaks about it in the same way, albeit that Derrida pretends to be secularized and not having to do anything with the religious Jewish tradition, as Rosenzweig claims to. But even Derrida speaks about a future which is always yet to come, but which can never be identified with something present. So what the result is that the present is put under a tension of an eternal future that is always about to come, which suggests that there are several time levels which are interrupting each other and which are simultaneous. And again, I'm insisting, I'm not pretending that I'm explaining something simple, but even I find this very difficult to think. But the listeners to this podcast, if they happen to be familiar, perhaps not with Rosenzweig, but perhaps a little with Derrida, and if Derrida refers to Inspector de Marx, or many other contexts, but his book on Marx, in which he repeatedly quotes Hamlet. So now I can talk in English. And Hamlet, at some point, when he is confronted with the shadow, the ghost of his father, who was dead, he was murdered. But he asks him, please, Hamlet, my son, you should revenge me, because the one who is king now, my brother, he killed me, and you should know. And Hamlet doesn't know what to do, because ghosts do not exist. This must be a dream. But he feels ethically, morally appealed. So what to do? Now, and then he says, the time is out of joint. Cursed be the spite that ever I was born to set it right. Now, Derrida repeats this quote a lot, and to explain the subject we're talking about, is the time is out of joint. The time is not regular. The time is irregular. And the irregularity of time, let's say the susceptibility of ordinary flat time, of being interrupted by another kind of temporality, that is what I'm talking at. And that is a dimension that might have got lost in the predominant forms of Judaism, and perhaps especially Christianity, and especially in Islam as well. Because it's difficult to think this. But at the same time, when we try to think time as an interruption, and try to deepening the notion of teleology, and perhaps even deepening Aristotle beyond his own intentions, might also make time existential again, might liberate time from being just the neutral context within which we are operating, and within which we are making plans for the future, the 5 years term in the Soviet Union, and all forms of planning that we do, towards time as something existential, as a tension which is imposed upon the here and now. And that might bring us back to some mystical articulations, which also, if you think of Meister Eckhart, for example, makes a lot of fuzz, or I say makes a lot of highly invest in the reinterpretation of the present, which is a fullness, rather than being just the present, just the here and now. So I hope it makes a little sense what I'm trying to say. I don't know, but it's very complex.
Yeah. So you have this quote which says, "Death is related to paving new ways through being." So bringing it back to what you were mentioning there of the present and the way in which we interpret time, in what sense do you see death as something which is altering our path, altering our conception of our being.
Yeah, in the following way. These are not apodictic claims, because who am I? As far as I know, I'm still alive, or maybe I should say I'm only alive. But I'm just trying to think and trying to think through certain intuitions which I have, and nothing more, nothing less. So I started from the possibility, or perhaps the reality, of trauma. There may be several forms of trauma, some of which are so big that they seem to be beyond repair. If terrible things happen to one, they cannot be repaired. It seems, apparently, throughout this lifetime. If you have been witness of mass murders of your family, nothing can repair this. However, should it be true that, this syllogism, should it be true, that trauma is a kind of fixation of consciousness, impairing perception, impeding a fuller perception of being, since we are so much attached to a past which prevents us from seeing things which are also true, which also manifest or even reveal themselves. Then B, if it's also true that consciousness can be extended, can be widened, should that be true? And should this happen with death, insofar as death lifts the ultimate barrier or boundary to consciousness? Then it might be so that death, whatever it is, consists of the widest circle, even a limitless or infinite circle, which circumvents trauma to such an extent that it might ultimately sublate. I don't know if that word can be used, sublate, that it deletes trauma. If you throw a stone in the pond, compared to that, ultimately, first you have some smaller circles, and they always widen until you don't see the circles anymore because they're too wide. So this is a speculation which I have, and one might find some consolation, albeit that it's based upon speculation in it, if one's traumatized, that death creates such a wide embracing circle that trauma is not only deleted by death, but that death also recreates the past. So that's what I was hinting at, recreates the path which always approached by us from a certain form of trauma, albeit in the form of a fixation. Historians are traumatized. We are all traumatized, so historians as well. Meaning that they are blindfolded by certain certain narrownesses that they are affected by, and that's what creates a need for subsequent historians that must correct their predecessors. That may shed a different light, an alternative light on the past or on pasts. So, in light of the possibility that always wider circle can be, drawn around fixations, ultimately around traumas, and in light of the fact that affects the past, resituates the elements in the past, since they are put in a wider context, that may change or alter the past, which might be absolutely paradoxical, if not contradictory, to those who believe that the past is something objective. The past has happened. We cannot change it. We cannot alter it. So I believe that the past can be altered, can be changed. But that death may be ultimately indispensable to do that. And it's. I think it will.
So is it our understanding of the past that's changed, or is it the actual past itself?
Both, because one cannot distinguish the past from our understanding of the past. There is no past apart from our understanding of it. What is our understanding? Our understanding is a kind of carrying out, exerting of consciousness. Consciousness is applied when we understand or when we know something, and consciousness, as such, is something mysterious, something which is susceptible to always being widened. So it's not apart from being, it's part of being, however difficult to understand.
So this is sort of you're talking about a system where memory is primary in relation to the way in which we investigate the world, because the way in which we deal with our memories and deal with our past is, that's from that is where we project our understanding. So what do you think then happens within a world such as our own, where memory is sort of getting shredded into bits and we can hardly remember anything, and we no longer, it seems, have the patience or attention to actually deal with anything? It seems to me that we're all existing in a very minute presence. We don't have, we've severed connections of maturation and understanding. So we exist, an event happens, we cling to that for a very brief few days, Corona, Greta Thunberg, whatever it wants to be, and then we move on. And there's very little in the way of memory or network or connection. What do you think happens to man in that situation then?
Well, thank you all in the first place for putting it this way, because I so much agree with you. And if you allow me to make it personal and still apply it to be an answer to your question. The way you interview me is, I feel, is patient. If you compare that to the majority of interviews, which I do not see them because I never watch television, but the news perhaps. They're so hasty, they're so accelerated, and people interviewed must formulate their answers in such a short time. Or politicians, for example, they are not granted time to think. They must give answer immediately. And the questions they're asked, they do not have answers that can be given immediately. Some questions are so like Brexit, they're so complex. How to answer these questions? So, and I think it will be the experience of all of us, those listening as well. If you ever had a conversation with someone which took time, in which patience prevailed, the conversation went much deeper than if there were no time. And even if I take another example from my teaching in class, I like teaching, and I think I told you, and teaching for students, etc., and lecture. And it happens so often, and you may have similar experiences, that a lot of interesting discussions happen toward the end of the meeting, and sometimes even during the break, when there is no time because people should go to another class. Well, of course, I'm not saying that should be abolished, because we have to have time frames, and there are other classes and other activities, of course. But it's still nevertheless interesting that interesting discussions happen at the fringes of official meetings. If I think about therapy, a lot of therapists can tell you that the most important remarks are made by patients when it's their time to leave. Of course, they have to leave at some moment. You cannot talk with a patient for hours and hours. There's no time. There are other patients waiting. But still, towards the end, towards the end of the official meeting, interesting things are said.
I think that falls into the same thing you were saying about TV interviews. So you're saying that I'm a patient interviewer, and I like to think that's because I don't have a bias. I have these questions laid out, but wherever we go because I'm interested in the knowledge and the information in itself and the ideas. Whereas I think there's a connection there. So TV interviews, they have a bias. They have something, I think, that they want an audio clip that they can use, or they want Boris Johnson to say a certain thing, or they want a certain answer. And the only reason they're in that particular place or time is because they want X. And the same, I think, and from that, once they've got that, they've got their reason to leave. So they no longer have to be in that little present where they don't really want to be, because they're not all that interested. But it's the same thing as therapy. It's, I think, probably the reason that and with meetings, probably the reason that interesting stuff comes up near the end is you don't have as much sunk cost. You're not as indebted, because you understand that at any moment you'll be able to leave the conversation. Whereas if you start the interesting thing mid-on, well, then there's a commitment, and there's a connection there that, if you do it near the end, then at any point you can quickly move into the next thing, and you don't have to worry about memory. You don't have to worry about a serious commitment to information or knowledge or actual passion. You can just, right, I'm off. There's the line, and because we're right next to the line, it doesn't matter.
And it may even illustrate what we said before, that the interesting moments during a discussion are they somehow interrupt the discussion. They interrupt regularity. They interrupt time frames. And I'm not saying that we should abolish time frames, because we cannot yet live in a world without time frames. Unfortunately, that would be a chaos, and those try to implement it would soon be disillusioned. It's impossible. But still, there's a kind of interruption. And I think when we talk about the news and people being interviewed, that the audience feels it if someone is really giving unpredictable answers. Some politicians, I don't know about England, but in the Netherlands we have politicians like, not talking about Geert Wilders. He's a populist. I don't know if you heard about him, the anti-Islam. Anyway, he's anti-Islam, as Islamist. He is but he is not of the kind I'm referring to, because he, in his own way, you can imagine anti-Islamist political views. He is predictable. Whereas in the past we had in the Netherlands Pim Fortuyn, but he was shot 20 years ago, or rest. You may not have heard. But he gave unpredictable answers. He was also called populist, but unpredictable answers, because the audience feel that here is someone, this is interesting, because he does not, he is not for sale. He doesn't simply give answers that the journalists are hinting at. He is simply himself. Whether you agree with him or disagree, that is another point. That doesn't matter. So, and one sometimes this is still another thing, but still deals with your question. Sometimes when giving a lecture somewhere, I suggested participants to during break or the end of the meeting to go and look around in the wardrobe, where people are hanging their you call it, their coats, etc. Because that is the margin. People who have nobody to talk to, who cannot have those fashionable, attractive discussions. People who don't have anybody, you can find them there, and there can discussions be had with the people who don't have anybody to talk to. I take this from Dostoevsky. He in his The Brothers Karamazov somewhere says that the interesting discussions are always had in stair walks. How do you call stair walks? Staircases, yeah. Stair walks, or on thresholds. This can be verified. Rereading Dostoevsky, interesting discussions are held on thresholds and in stair walks. So outside, in limit positions. I think you like the word limit. Me too. I like the word limit as well. Limit positions. That's what I like. So sorry, this is a bit extended answer to the question. I like limit positions, and they disrupt time, but they cannot be created. I think, we can prepare ourselves for it, but sometimes it simply doesn't come. Sometimes.
Well, no, that's the sort of the truism that spontaneous meetings and spontaneous things are always the better ones, and yes. I don't think there's no real way that you can define why that is. I think it's potentially it's something to do with time pressure and the understanding that if something's spontaneous, you don't know how long it's going to last for, so you attune yourself to it much more precisely than you would something. If you understand you have an hour, then there's not as much pressure. But if it's in a threshold or a limit or a stairwell, then everything needs to be said quickly.
Yeah. If for example, if we for interview we only had let's say 2 minutes or so, my personal pathology would have let me say things which I might have been ashamed of later, because under pressure I might, and some others perhaps too, might say crazy things just by sole pressure of the moment. Whereas with more time and relaxation, it might be more beneficent to the conversation.
Moving back to death, one thing I want to ask is how we can, because death and suffering, as we've sort of glossed over, in terms of they are seen as I see it as ethical standpoints and moral standpoints. So suffering is always bad, and allowing someone to die is arguably generally agreed to be bad, and death itself is bad, but in a very moralistic sort of way, that if someone's alive, then it's a moral good. Now, I don't agree with this at all. In fact, I'm not sure that they should even really be on that common notion of that spectrum of morality. I don't think that's a good place to put them, because they're both death and suffering, as you've stated with regards to memory, are like nodes in experience from which to learn from. Death is always at the end, of course, but you learn in relation to that as opposed to push against it. So how do you think we can move away from or remove or understand suffering and death in non-moral terms?
I think suffering will always be there anyway. It cannot be avoided. Whatever we say to each other, it will always interrupt us. I think suffering and death are not to be romanticized, because suffering is simply suffering and death is death. And are in a way tragic and extremely tragic, extremely painful. Nevertheless, I have a theory, and not even theory, but even experience, that there is something about suffering which does not end suffering, but which opens other gates or windows. Meister Eckhart once said, suffering is the fastest horse bringing you to God, something like that. And one must be careful with this quote. And it's one must perhaps not quote it to somebody who is in actual suffering, unless the conversation is serious and deep already. So one must be very reticent, but still I believe that there might be something true in it. But as said, I cannot insist on it. We must be careful with it. So I have had a very difficult period behind me, extremely difficult, and the suffering was suffering, just suffering, absolute dark void. But throughout the suffering, I discovered that there is a kind of beyond, which is not in the Heideggerian, which is not available. Maybe I shouldn't even refrain from using the word is. I don't know which word to use. Maybe I simply lack the language due to whatever impoverished language that we are all speaking. But there is something, a dimension, beyond the corner, which puts it into perspective, a wider perspective. Albeit that the suffering is still suffering, difficult. There might be a kind of a pleasure in suffering ultimately, but very difficult to be had, very difficult to be repeated. Well, there are the extreme. You may be familiar with Georges Bataille. He takes the extreme example of the China, the picture of the Chinese who's cut to pieces. It's terrible.
Death by 1,000 cuts.
Oh, terrible! But anyway, Bataille's claim was that this man, in his last moments, was ecstatic. I'm not including it. I think it's good, and I hope it's truth. Of course, I cannot say this from experience because I haven't been cut to 1,000 pieces yet. I hope I never will. And the friend you referred to, the brother of your colleague, but. No, I don't. Let's say I don't exclude that in and throughout suffering, a perspective can be had or experienced or witnessed, or maybe I should find still another verb to use, which looms around the corner, which gives a kind of hope or offers a kind of perspective. But as said, everything I say and the way I say it right now might be poor and flawed and too easygoing.
You don't think hope can be retrieved or maturation can be retrieved from suffering?
I do think that, but this should not be repeated too easily, because it might give an easy way out. So, you're suffering, so you will experience hope, or so. It's not. The suffering must be suffered by those who are suffering it, and oftentimes the bystanders cannot do anything but just being there. And maybe say something, but sometimes just be there. sometimes there are no words, or just say something which pops up in you. But it's very difficult to say something to someone who's suffering. Somebody can be scared or afraid or have pain, a terrible pain. This is really an empathy, I think. So I believe there is hope, and that hope can be had from suffering. And I even believe that sometimes can be said as a consolation to those who are suffering. But it should be said with care and with paying meticulous attention to the circumstances and the situation. And one might have to take to study the response which we are given, for we might be too hasty in coming up with our consolation. We may learn here from people who have been in a position of consoling their fellows who they try to suffer, or therapists or pastoral caretakers or whoever, because there are pastoral caretakers from whatever religious tradition. These are the ones who are facing the fire, who are not just coming up with easy, well, some of them perhaps, but if you are working from as a pastoral caretaker or counselor, pastoral counselor, from whatever religious tradition, Islam or Christianity or Judaism, you are soon, disillusioned, that your easy-going stories will not help anybody, and that you really must go to the bottom with the suffering other. And that those people can teach others what may be wise, how to act, what to say or what not to say, what attitude to take with people who are suffering. And that whatever tradition you have behind you, it must be reinvented when trying to console somebody else, or when having a suffering experience yourself. Your background tradition must be if it's esoteric tradition, be that as it may. It may be consoling you when nothing is going wrong, but when you're suffering, that tradition must be reinvented. How does it speak to me right now? And that is, that can be painful, because you may have been relying on that tradition or that truth or whatever you want to like to call it. Well, everybody has some kind of truth one wants to live by, but it must be reinvented at a moment. And a lot of, especially Jewish thinkers, and one cannot read them enough, even though you're not Jewish, even though you want to be something completely different. But they have reflected upon this. Sorry for bringing this up as well in the interview, but Jewish thinkers, you can read Jewish thinkers and then go back to your own field of orientation. Several Jewish thinkers, they refer to this tradition of what they call the absence of God, of the dark night, of believing in God, but don't know even who he or she or it is in whom you believe. Who is God? I think I believed in God so far. I followed commandments or whatever I did in a liberal way, orthodox way. But right now, I don't know who this God is. And that is something that belongs to religious traditions. So, of course, there are cheap ways. You referred to them some time ago already. Cheap, the Orthodox, and the IS is the worst variety that you can imagine, the IS. But I think that at the heart of religious traditions, there are really those who faced the night of not knowing who or what the God whom they believe in is anymore. And again, Judaism can be taken as a paradigm, like the Holocaust, being a faithful believer, and that faith doesn't save you from the gas chambers or for being shot. This is another interest of mine. I'm very fascinated by Jewish philosophy, but also by the Jewish tradition, diaspora, etc., etc. I read a lot of biographies, even by the evildoers, by Hitler, etc., because I wanted to understand this mystery. How can you want to annihilate this tradition, which has so much in store? Anyway, those insisting on the night, the obscurity, absolute obscurity. They struggled with it as well. They prevent us from being cheap and easygoing with our traditions.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add, or anything key that we've missed that you think would?
No, I want to. There are always things that can be added, but we should limit ourselves. But I want to say that I'm very thankful for this interview, and I really, really, really want to praise you for the wonderful way and for the welcoming way in which you asked questions, and also the way you all gave utterance to feelings and sensitivities, which I 100% share with you. So I don't know if you will let this be a part of the podcast, but if so, then
sure.
I want to underline you're a wonderful, wonderful person, and I want to wish you a lot of success with these initiatives. I hope we can, whatever way, collaborate in whatever future initiative. It doesn't matter what.
Okay, thanks, Rico.
Thank you.